Hi, we're back for Odell number 3. So we were talking about what the goal of the garden school was, right? And it was a response to the difficulties of the lives of contemporary Greeks. Epicurus found that people were suffering, right? That although society had succeeded in many ways, there were still many shortcomings and many problems that were creating a state of anxiety and desperation and greed. And in order to combat that, he developed this concept of the garden school. And he found that he needed to bring people outside of contemporary society in order to kind of get them to reshape and renegotiate how they saw themselves and their relationships with others. And most importantly, to kind of question their goals, right? What was the purpose of their lives? What were they trying to pursue? And also to avoid and find a way through fears and anxieties in particular, right? To ground these different individual consciousnesses in such a way that there was more freedom to be expansive and to look around them, right? And also to remake their relationships in a healthier way. Now, as Odell points out, you know, 2,500 years later, the in the 1960s, many idealistic young people decided to break from the world that surrounded them and go off into communes, right, as a response both to the Vietnam War, to problems that arose from racism and gender inequality also, right? They looked around them, they saw the contemporary world was a sick place in their minds, and they said, well, let's go off and live a kind of a healthier life, both mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, right? And so these idealistic young people set off, typically to the countryside, with a little bit of inherited money, no doubt, um, but rural land was quite inexpensive at that time because it was still part of the transition from family farms to mechanized farming. So that meant that a lot of small family farms were cheap and available. And so many of these young people formed new kinds of societies, right? And they said, well, look, the first thing we have to do is replace capitalism with these networks of interdependent communities, right? And there was this idea that we can craft and build things, right, and farm in such a way that we will be self-sufficient. Um, Now, that turned out to be a lot of wishful thinking. It turns out that self-sufficiency is, in fact, extremely difficult to orchestrate under almost any circumstances, right? And in practice, as a wide survey of communes makes clear, most commune members ended up relying on social assistance and welfare. But that does not change the fact that some of what they were thinking about and talking about were kind of important. So the communards pointed out that money was very, very difficult to dismantle, not so much as a tool of a medium of exchange, right? But in terms of this sort of a desirable, treasure that individuals hoarded greedily, right? That, in other words, that money was almost like a sickness. That greed was kind of like a sickness that took over, and even people who were very well-meaning and really cared about one another would get into fights and conflicts over money, right? People became defensive. They had um, fears about giving up the pleasures, right? And I can imagine this, right? Money that money can buy you, right, in favor of giving everything to the group, right? So it turned out also that there were these kinds of race, class, and gender problems that bubbled up inside these communes. In other words, the women often ended up famously doing most of the cleaning and cooking, right? Once again. So, in some cases, communes replicated traditional gender roles more so than modern life was doing at that time as women were entering the workforce. Now, not always, right? I don't want to be too paint with too broad a brush here, but it is true that communes, when looked at up close, struggled to deal with these very difficult political problems, right? Race was another one, and class, right? Wealthy people versus more working class people. There were frictions, right? There really was, and so one of the things that kept happening was uh, the ability of the commune to make any decisions kept breaking down, right? And so this sort of democratic decision-making process was too difficult for many people, and they ended up just either making decisions for themselves, by themselves, right? Or leading all decisions up to a kind of a leader, right? In which case the commune morphed or could morph into something more like a religious cult, right? And so all of these problems and um, difficulties meant that communes were very unstable places in the 1960s, and people kind of kept leaving them, and people would leave contemporary society because they found it exhausting and nerve-wracking and revolting in some ways, and also destructive and violent to the environment. And they would go to communes where they would be then subjected to other forms of difficulties in terms of living with their fellow human beings, right? And they would be forced to leave. So, one of the things that Odell is asking us to contemplate here with the idea of retreating from a very difficult world is, you know, what is our responsibility to the world around us? And if we decide to retreat, to try to remake all society in miniature, right, is that not, in a sense, rejecting all the other humans and saying, well, I'm sorry, but this is my lifeboat and you're not welcome in it, right? um, and, you know, you can look around and see the fact that there are some, political figures out there who are encouraging fright among population in order to keep people fearful and in many ways in order to maintain a kind of a political and economic status quo, right? So on the one hand, communes and the Epicurean garden school, among other examples, right, did not successfully attain the capacity to really remake the world, so to speak, right? But on the other hand, they clearly showed that something about the status quo was off, right? That modern life was poisoning people in some respects, and people were kind of desperate to leave it. They just didn't know how to remake something that was also kind of its own self-sustaining political and social entity. So, you know, the optimism that communes represent is very important, right? Idealism cannot simply be discarded or dismissed as some sort of pie in the sky, airy fairy, rainbows and unicorns fantasy, right? We need to hold on to idealism, Odell is saying. However, we do need to reflect on what happens when, the modern world becomes too difficult, too scary, and we decide to completely withdraw and retreat, right? So we're working towards something kind of nuanced and subtle here in Odell's argument, and I hope that you write to me if you have any questions. Thank you very much. Okay.